Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my November wrap up. And November was not the greatest reading month for me. November was NaNoWriMo, so it was National Novel Writing Month, which I participated in. I was technically a nano rebel, I guess you would call, because my only goal was 20,000 words. I wanted to finish the draft of the project that I'm currently working on, which would have gotten me to 70,000 words. I have reached 70,000 words. I am not what you would call done because I still have the very last part of the book to finish. And so I'm trying to push myself through that, but it's a little bit bittersweet. I'm going to feel very accomplished, I think, when I get it done, but I think it's also going to be very sad, a little bit sad. So that was really my main focus in November. That's why I was a little bit off the grid in terms of posting on BookTube. I think I only finished maybe 4 or 5 books, which is not a bad reading month in terms of numbers for me. But I don't really think there was but maybe one title that stuck out to me as a favorite of the year. So let's just go on and get right into it. So the first book that I read in the month of November was Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. And this was historical fantasy set in Sicily about the princes of hell who were essentially based on the 7 deadly sins. It was about witches. It was a very... not a convoluted story, but it was very much like an urban fantasy. It was set up very much like kind of those urban fantasies that maybe you grew up on. I know I did. Urban fantasy was really big when I was in my teenage years, and it's a lot of what I read. And so this kind of felt a little bit nostalgic to me. I don't know that I very much cared for it at the end of the day. I picked it up mainly because it was set in Italy. It was set in Sicily, actually, and in a very kind of generic historical time period. It never gave a date, so you're not quite sure when it was, but I would guess in the 1800s. But since my work in progress for NaNoWriMo is also historical fantasy set in Italy, I thought it would be interesting to see what somebody else was doing. And of course there are 0 similarities between what I've been working on and this. And so in some ways that's been helpful for me contextualizing maybe what my book is it YA or is it not? But I think this was a really interesting and different read for me in terms of YA. I read the first of Kerri Maniscalco's other series, Stalking Jack the Ripper, and that was fine. That's also one I could have taken or left, and as a matter of fact, I left because I never carried on with the series. So this one I feel a similar way about. This was just kind of a run-of-the-mill 3 stars, maybe a 2.5 stars if I'm feeling a little less generous. It's okay. I don't foresee myself carrying on with the series because I'm intrigued by some things, but what I'm intrigued about I think has very little to do with the main plot or with the main characters. So I'm not really sure how I would feel about carrying on with the series unless those elements that I really liked came to the forefront, and since they weren't the main characters or even the main storyline, I doubt that will happen. In many ways, this feels like a return to form with the urban fantasy that was really big, maybe about 10, 15 years ago. I'm interested to see if this serves to kind of resurrect that genre in YA, specifically with kind of paranormal romance, which was really big in YA. So I'm interested to see if this is kind of an indication of a larger trend in publishing, but I don't know that I will carry on with it. Next, in terms of nonfiction November, I picked up Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich, and this is an oral history about the fall of communism, the fall of the USSR, and how it dissolved around 1990, 1991. And so she has interviews with very different people from very different walks of life from around 1991 to around 2012, chronicling and looking back on their experiences on how the USSR dissolved, what things they were promised by the government that they never received, how people portrayed the Soviet government as being very oppressive when they didn't feel like it was. It's a very interesting read, and of course it is very dark because it is telling real people's stories from a very tumultuous time in history. And so in that way, I can't rate it. I would rate it 5 stars. If I had to rate it, I would rate it 5 stars, but it feels a little bit weird to me to put a number on somebody's life story, on something somebody experienced, because every one of these chapters, these perspectives on things is very different, and yet they are also all the same, if that makes any sense, because they are all talking about things through a very similar lens. I don't know that I have read an oral history outside of being in school, and so this was just genuinely fascinating to me. I highly recommend it if you're in the right headspace to read it, and I very rarely was. And so what I did was read a chapter here, put it down, and intersperse it with something else, and I think that's the way to do it. Also, in terms of nonfiction November, I read The Eternal City, A History of Rome in Maps by Jessica Maier, and this was sent to me by the University of Chicago Press, and so thank you to them because this is an incredible book. This was another 5-star read, and this is, to me, the standout of the month, and this will definitely be going on my favorites of the year. I talked about it quite a bit in my last weekly reading blog, so I will link to that down below. But the reason that I really took to this is not only that it's about Rome, but I really liked how she contextualized the maps. So you get maps from essentially every era in Rome's history by map makers of every era, if that makes sense. So you will get kind of a remaining ancient map, then you will get a medieval perspective on what the ancient city would have looked like, and then you get a more modern perspective on what the ancient city would have looked like, and the differences between those maps is very, very interesting. And I loved how she discussed the thought process that goes into making certain maps, why certain maps were drawn in a particular way, why there were inaccuracies maybe, such as sometimes people would put certain monuments on the outside of the city walls. They would include monuments from outside the city walls and put them inside. And so it's always interesting to see, you know, did they do that because they'd never been to Rome before and they were just kind of drawing a map based on what they know Rome to be? Or did they draw it like that because maybe their perspective on the city is different depending on where they were standing, kind of which of the 7 hills they were on top of looking out at the city. So it's a really, really interesting book, and I think if you love Rome, you should definitely pick it up. I will say though, when I went to write my review for this, I saw a lot of people complaining and saying this really isn't the best beginner's book to Rome, and it shouldn't be sold as that, and I don't necessarily think that it has been sold as a beginner's book to Rome. It certainly is not. I think it could be if you went and searched and read maybe the Wikipedia article for certain periods in Rome's history before you sat down to read this. I think it definitely could be kind of a beginner's book. But this book is about the maps entirely. It's not really about the history of the city, though the history of the city definitely influences how she discusses the maps, because where the city is at in terms of time indicates how people have looked back on it, indicates how people are maybe drawing maps of it currently. And I think this is a really excellent thing to do with the city of Rome, because even though Rome is the eternal city, there is so much about it that has evolved and changed across the centuries. And in the modern day, maybe, we now know where everything was, and we've done a lot of excavations, and there are all these different parts of Rome that you can see today, but maybe during the medieval period and even the early modern period, they were buried under sediment. So it's a really interesting thing to show in maps, because I think maps really generally show where Rome was in the beginning and how it has developed into a modern city. And of course, so much of Rome's ancient city survives, and it's really where a lot of the main city today is still located in the same area. And so it's interesting to see how the ancient city has progressed into a very modern city. And so I highly recommend this, especially if you are a Rome junkie. Next, I DNF'd History of a 6 Weeks Tour by Mary and Percy Shelley. I know. This was so sad. I think, to be honest, I just wasn't in the mood for it. And I think it's also just a very choppily written thing. It is very clearly her first experience in the publishing world, her first experience with real writing. Unfortunately, none of Mary Shelley's juvenilia survives, so we don't really know what she was doing prior to this, but I don't know that travel writing was her calling. So this is in 1816, when Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley have kind of eloped, and they've gone to France specifically with her stepsister, Claire Claremont. And France was the only country I got through, but they went to several other places. They went to Switzerland, they went to Germany, I believe, and I think they went to Belgium and the Netherlands on this trip. And this was a very hard trip in reality for them. They went to France having been raised on the ideals of the French Revolution and thinking the French Revolution is really something to aspire to. And yet the France they enter is post-Napoleon. 1816, it is post-Napoleon. And so the country is not at all what they envisioned it to be. And Mary Shelley does kind of discuss that in this a little bit, but knowing the real story, it's interesting to read her perspective on events and to see what she kind of wanted cleaned up before she published it, because it was apparently a very horrid time. I mean, a very hard time when they were traveling through the French countryside. So I definitely would say it's not a beginner's book for Mary Shelley. It's not the first book from Mary Shelley you should read. And knowing what I know of Percy Shelley, I don't think there was very much of him in this work. I think he contributed a letter or two, and he definitely contributed Mont Blanc, which is one of his most famous poems, which is really beautiful. But I would definitely say at this point in time, he is a far more skilled writer than she is. But I think it's interesting that she wanted to do a travelogue, and I'm sure she wanted to do this because of Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote some very famous kind of travelogue-like letters from her time in Scandinavia, and she traveled through Denmark and Sweden and Norway. And I'm really interested in that because I lived in Denmark when I studied abroad. I studied in Copenhagen, and so I would be really excited to see Copenhagen in a classic context. I'm sure that was informing kind of Mary Shelley's process with this, is knowing that's something that her mother did and that was really successful for her mother. But I think there's probably a reason we haven't heard too much about History of a 6 Weeks Tour. I do hope to come back and finish it. And it's not a bad book, I do want to say that. It's not a badly written book. It's just very choppy. It's very, very short. I think she is a little bit more preoccupied with telling the correct version of events than with actually like putting her heart and soul on the table and saying what she's experiencing when she goes to these places. It felt in some parts, especially in the beginning, to read a little bit like her diary, to read a little bit like, okay, well, we went here. We got in the carriage and then we went here. We hired a mule and then we went here. And it's like, okay, but give me something. Give me some good description, Mary. So this was clearly, I think, one of her first forays into writing. And so she definitely improved after this. Next, I picked up The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss, and I just loved this. This took me by storm. This was a really, really refreshing read. And this is a historical fantasy set in Victorian London for the most part. And it's following most of the most famous Victorian monsters that you've ever heard of. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, who is not Victorian, Dr. Moreau, and all of them have had daughters. So this is the daughter story. And this first book is really more of a mystery setup and coming together of all of these characters. And it's just so much fun. If you love Victorian literature, definitely pick it up. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are also in this, and I really, really love them. I definitely think this is my favorite iteration of Sherlock Holmes that I have ever seen. And so I think it's a really fun, kind of cheeky read if you're somebody who's very familiar with classics of this time period, because there are often allusions to other characters from other books. And so it's just a lot of fun. It's a really fun type of thing, and it feels very much like something like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and I typically really love things like that blend a bunch of different characters from a bunch of different works, and I really liked this because it was female-centric. I have to say, unfortunately, I think this first book is going to be the strongest entry in the series, because on the heels of this, I picked up European Travel for the Monstrous Gentlewoman, which is book 2 in the series. And you might can tell by the size alone that I had problems with it. It was twice the length of the first book, and it's also twice the length of the third. So interestingly enough, this is the biggest book in the series, and it definitely does not need to be. What's so weird though is that you feel like definitely something is happening in every chapter, but you don't necessarily feel like the plot is moving forward, if that makes sense. And so the plot of this one is picking up immediately after the first book, where there were some clues about other characters from another famous Victorian horror book. And you were kind of curious all through the first one whether or not she would bring in these characters, whether or not she would tackle this book. And she definitely did. And by rights, I should like this one the most of the whole entire series because it dealt with those characters and it dealt with kind of a creature that I am really, really fond of. But the length just took it down for me. I can't believe how much I felt like this book needed to be edited because there were a lot of really weird quirks to the writing that I definitely think an editor should have caught. I mean, instances where multiple different times things have been reiterated to us. Instances where we definitely heard the same thing 4 or 5 times within one chapter. And I just was thinking to myself, now how did an editor not catch this? And I think definitely had you taken out some of those instances, had you cut some things down, this book could have been half the size and been far more successful. So I still have the third in this trilogy to go, and I don't know how I'm gonna feel about it. And I know the third in the trilogy is going to deal with one of my least favorite Victorian works. And so on another level, I'm kind of dreading that after dealing with not one of my favorite Victorian works, but one of my favorite Victorian creatures. I felt like this was a blunder, so I'm now worried about the rest of the series. The first book can kind of stand on its own, and so I highly, highly recommend it, especially if you're somebody who has read a lot of these classics. It's a little bit like putting a puzzle together and figuring out clues and trying to figure out, now, is she really gonna play with this? Is she gonna bring in this famous character? Is she gonna deal with this famous novel from this time period? And typically she does, and that's what makes it a really fun and exciting read. I just think this one really could have been cut down and I would have been far happier for it. Last but not least is a book that I am still in the middle of, which is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This is also historical fantasy, and it is set in the 1920s in Shanghai, and it is a Romeo and Juliet retelling with rival gangs. And it is everything that it sounds like. It is just absolutely wonderful. I think this might wind up being one of my favorite books of the year, depending on how it ends, depending on if it sticks the landing or not. And I feel like it probably will, but this is going to be a series, so it's not going to end the full Romeo and Juliet story. And I just think that the retelling elements of this have been so fresh and fun. I have really enjoyed figuring out who plays who, and it's very easy to see which characters are going to occupy which roles from the play. I think she has really taken the archetypes of those characters and made them do different things for this plot, and I really enjoy it. One of the main cruxes of the story, perhaps the main plot, is that there is a monster in Shanghai that is causing people to go mad and kill themselves, and that's what's drawing the Romeo and Juliet characters together. And so in a way, you feel like you know where the story is going because you definitely know Romeo and Juliet. But at the same time, you have no clue where this monster storyline is going to go and whether or not they are going to solve the mystery in this book. And so I have really enjoyed that. I think that has been one of the best elements of the book, is that it's very familiar and yet it is very new. And I also think she has done such a wonderful job at portraying Shanghai and really giving Shanghai its own character. And I love a book where the setting feels very rich and the setting feels a little bit like it's a character in the narrative as well. And she has definitely done that with Shanghai here. So I am really looking forward to finishing this, hopefully this weekend. So that was my monthly wrap up. Only a few books, and not many that I felt very passionately about one way or the other, and that's always a little bit of a disappointment to me personally, as if a book is gonna be bad, I want it to be bad. I want it to inspire some hatred in me. But books that are just okay or middle of the line where I don't have very much to say, that's unfortunate to me. I feel like I had some middling books this month, and I did have a couple of greats in The Eternal City and These Violent Delights. I am thinking about doing an entire video on the Eternal City and how things in Rome have changed across the centuries, how things in the city have morphed. So I would love to know if you would be interested in that. Please tell me down below. I would love to hear what you read in the month of November, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.